So dear listener, please subscribe to our channel. Expect we else. Enjoy watching how good it is to find oneself in a cozy wooden house with a roaring fireplace during the freezing winter. When the room is plunged into darkness, the fire, impatiently leaping among the birch logs, seems like the beacon's flame guiding ships through stormy seas. As you add a few fresh logs, the stove starts to hum contentedly, and through the closed door of the firebox, you can hear the crackling of burning wood. I glanced at the thermometer hanging across from the wooden planks. The temperature was steadily rising. The red column had already reached 15, and it showed no signs of stopping. This was despite the fact that it was minus 34 degrees outside. I built this little cabin 5 years ago. I deliberately chose the most remote corner of the forest, worked all summer alone, and finally constructed what I had dreamt of for a long time. Some women, including my wife, just can't understand why I'd venture so deep into the wilderness and spend time here in solitude. But that's precisely the appeal, and to be alone and far away from people. Initially, I suggested to LA to visit my forest retreat, but she adamantly refused. Mosquitoes cold, solitude, even with me. She preferred glamorous social gatherings, chatty friends, and the brightly lit nightlife of the city filled with advertisements. I didn't try to change that, and philosophically accepted it as a given. The solitary life in nature wasn't for my wife. And that's that. The cabin stood on the banks of a small river with the charming name Gaiwa. It was a peculiar peninsula, surrounded by dark waters on 3 sides. Despite the biting cold, the river had not completely frozen, and even now, in the midst of winter, I could hear the cheerful gurgling of water over the stones. I adjusted the wick of the kerosene lamp, and the room brightened. I relaxed, absorbing the warmth spreading through the room, leaning against the wall where the moose hide hung. I try as I might, I couldn't completely seal the gaps between the logs with moss. The cabin still had drafts. So I had to hang a rug on the wall, or in my case, a hide. Right in the center of this improvised rug, carefully screwed in to avoid damaging the fur, hung an old but functional single-barrel shotgun of 16 gauge. Honestly, I'm not a hunter. I greatly admire the subculture, but I've never killed any animals for pleasure in my life. There have been instances when I had to shoot at a beast, but only for self-defense or sustenance. All the hides, antlers, and even the wolf skull that adorn the walls of the cabin were purchased from hunters for decoration. I'm not a diehard pacifist, and if necessary, I can shoot at a person. But satisfying my ego by killing animals is not my thing. As an antique dealer, many interesting items pass through my hands. But typically, I sell everything. Anything. However, when it comes to hunting, it sticks to my hands. Few people know that many hunting artifacts are sold at European auctions. I won't say they fetch astronomical prices, but the monetary value of some artifacts is substantial. Much of what now hangs on the walls of my cabin, I bought in Europe. I must admit that the hunting culture there is miles ahead of ours. I once attended a hunt in the district. A group of serious men showed up with automatic rifles. The beaters drove several boars towards them, which they shot as if from a machine gun. Then they skinned the carcasses, tossing the hides aside. The outcome was predictable. A collective drinking binge, certain female specimens, and a terrible hangover. No romance, no battle with wild beasts, nothing. They killed, skinned, dismembered, got drunk, misbehaved, and left, leaving the forest in a mess. That's the extent of their hunting. That's once at a flea market, an elderly intellectual gentleman was selling an antique brass hunting horn, covered in a greenish patina. The horn was adorned with genuine leather and hung from a leather cord. I was immediately drawn to it, an antique, and more importantly, a rarely encountered item. The seller asked for a reasonable sum, and without haggling, I purchased this hunting artifact. The horn is used for calling dogs during hunts, whether they be hounds or greyhounds. Its piercing melodious sound carries far through the forest or across the fields. I didn't have any dogs, but I hung the horn alongside the shotgun on the moose hide. I put on my sheepskin coat, which I had brought here back in the autumn, and stepped outside before bedtime to breathe in the frigid air. Silence enveloped me. The silver moon brightly illuminated the snow-covered treetops, casting a silvery path toward my home. I took a deep breath of the icy cold air and coughed. But the frost cut through my throat. Silence. Not a single animal or bird made a sound. Even the cheeky, raucous magpie seemed to have gone into hiding somewhere. In the silence, it seemed to me that I could hear the branches of trees cracking from the cold. I gazed at the snow-covered spruces and realized that winter had finally arrived. Soon, the first real frost would come. I marveled at the sleeping, twilight forest, but for some reason, an inexplicable unease grew within me. Finally, morning arrived. I shook my head, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. I got off the bunk, threw on my sheepskin coat, and stepped out of the cabin. I scanned the area for my skis. They stood where I had left them, right under the shelter, snug against the wall. The cold had subsided by morning, but still clung to my nose and nipped at my cheeks. I needed to make my way out of here and head back home. However, that required covering about 10 kilometers to reach my destination. I reached the abandoned peat plant where I had left my car. There was no way to drive it to the cabin, so I returned to the cabin, stoked the nearly extinguished stove, and started getting ready. I hid the shotgun in a hiding spot, just in case of unwelcome visitors. Who knows who might stumble upon my dwelling in my absence? I closed the door, put on my skis, and set out on my journey. But according to my calculations, I should reach the peat plant in about 2 hours. I arrived in town at night, shaking with excitement the whole way. And only when the lights of the suburbs flashed by did I relax a little. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't drive the car to the front door, but left it not far from the gate. I had a large plot of land, so there was plenty of room. I picked up my bag and walked to the front door. I opened the door with my key and entered the hall, greeted by total silence. I turned on the light and realized there was no one on the first floor. Strange, what was I supposed to see? It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning, and my wife had been asleep for a long time. For a while I stood and admired how the light played on the various blades hanging on the walls, real oriental carpets and edged weapons that I had brought back from my business trips. The ancient steel seemed to lurk in the long pile of the carpets, hiding its deadly power for the time being. I set to my bag and went into the kitchen, pouring myself a whiskey and drinking it almost in one gulp. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It sounded like someone shrieking. Anxiety instantly entered my brain, and I listened more closely. The extraneous sounds were coming from the second floor. I took the broad-bladed sword off the wall and, trying not to knock my boots on the steps, started to climb up to the top. There was the bedroom. I carefully pulled the door open and saw 2 naked bodies intertwined in ecstasy on our marital bed. My wife, Allo, was with an unfamiliar, curly-haired man and threw her head back, her voice hoarse with passion as she shouted deeper, deeper, more. Oh God, how good! I could clearly hear her lover's voice, rhythmically swatting her. For you now, Bertine's a whore? That's your whore? Am I better than your loser? The man continued to question. Yes, you're the best. I love you, my wife responded with a loud groan. I realized it was time to intervene, so I coughed and the 2 on the bed finally saw me. The lover, uncovered, climbed out from under my wife and stared at me absent-mindedly. Who is it? He turned to Ally. There was disappointment in his voice. Disappointment mixed with curiosity in his question. It's my husband. The wife squeaked and pulled the sheet up to her chin. Ah, the husband. Almost cheerfully said the male. Go take a walk. We're not done yet. He scratched his hairy chest and went at me, clearly intending to throw me out of the room. His insolence made my eyes darken. But I quickly pulled myself together. A thought flashed through my mind. Is he immortal? For some reason, it made me laugh. I threw forward my sword arm. The blade whistled through the air. A bloody streak appeared on the male's face. No. I struck flat. I'm not a killer. The hairy lover roared and lunged at me. I saw it coming and ducked from his straight punch aimed at my face. I struck him in the jaw with my sword hand. The male clenched his teeth and fell to the floor. You killed him? Allah shouted frantically. It's Tomas. His guys will bury you. I said nothing, dialing the police number on my cell phone. Hello, what's your emergency? I got an answer almost instantly. A stranger broke into my house. Help, he's probably trying to kill me. I yelled into phone, imitating hysteria. Then I took off the stand a weighty steel poker for the fireplace and carefully put it into the hand of the hairy guest lying knocked out. Olo looked at me in silence. The hysteria seemed to be over. When the naked lover was loaded into the car, the familiar captain took me aside. Keep this in mind. This is Thomas. He runs the market. A lawyer is coming tomorrow and he'll probably be released. He's a vindictive bastard. They're in trouble. Thank you, Sir Gravik. I understand everything. Forewarned is forearmed. I shook the captain's hand. When I returned to the bedroom, I lay motionless, covered up to her neck with a sheet. Shims, I remained silent. There were no more feelings left, only an unbearable pain burning in my chest. Eventually, my wife began to sob, curling up into a ball and trembling all over. Jolly, I uttered her once-beloved name with disgust. Vertipal, I'm leaving now. I'll sleep downstairs. Make sure that when I wake up in the morning, you're not here. She started to say something through her tears, but I didn't listen and quickly left the bedroom. When I woke up, Ale was still at home. She tried to explain something to me, begged for forgiveness. She sang an old woman's song about a lack of attention, about how I had stopped seeing a woman in her. She even went as far as to claim she had cheated out of great love for me. And according to her words, she would now be faithful and devoted to me. She would remain faithful to me for the rest of her life, until the grave. She mentioned being forced, but she only loved me. At the end of her monologue, Alla fell to her knees and grabbed my legs, begging for forgiveness. But something inside me had snapped, and I silently listened to her nonsense, wanting only one thing: for her to leave as quickly as possible. When the taxi arrived, Alla stood by the car for a long time, still hoping for something. Then she got into the car and disappeared from my life. The next day, an unfamiliar man arrived at my place, appearing to be a lawyer by the look of him. He was a young, quick-witted fellow with a long nose and long hair tied in a bun, making him resemble a rat. He emerged from a large black suit and approached my gates. Once the intercom rang. "What are you on?" Shins, I asked, feigning rudeness as I scrutinized the uninvited guest on the screen. "Meister Koltsev." The lawyer's voice was tinged with disdain. "We need to talk." "Vertitions, I don't want anything." Damiv. Snacks supported eagerly for his reaction. It was evident that the lawyer didn't expect such a reception. He remained silent for a while, then pressed the intercom button again. "Well, what else?" Say said, somewhat impatiently. "My Meister Koltsevi etzt." His voice became much more polite. "I have a matter to discuss with you. Please let me in." I pressed the button, and the gate opened. "Mr. Koltsevik, Thomas Eric Liebig wants to file a lawsuit against you for moral damages. But he's a kind person and wants to talk to you first." The lawyer closely watched my reaction. "I've nothing to discuss with your master. He invaded my home and attacked me. It's high time for me to sue him." I smirked arrogantly. "Your wife invited Thomas Eric Liebig. He was her guest. After all, this is her home too." The lawyer persisted. "The house belongs to me. My wife isn't even registered here, so it's clearly illegal trespassing on private property." I stared directly into the man's eyes. "Should have just shot your Thomas." "Thomas Eric Liebig disagrees with that." The lawyer retorted obstinately. "He wants to meet you and discuss compensation for the injuries. I've nothing to discuss with him. And for now, get out." I decisively stood up from my chair. The lawyer silently retreated. But I understood that it was only the beginning. Like my mobile phone rang. It was a familiar number. "I'm listening." I quickly answered. "So we have an order. Are you at home now?" The caller got straight to the point. "Yes, come over." A middle-aged man with a slight bald spot on his temple sat across from me. "I need ancient Eastern silver. It doesn't matter which region it's from, preferably from the 16th to 17th century," my interlocutor said as he took a sip from his glass. "Coins, jewelry, or utensils?" I inquired. "Both," the man replied with a smirk. "Preferably from Afghanistan, or at least from Central Asia. Except people India. India works too," the man said, placing the glass on the table. "So, are you interested?" "What's the price?" I asked, feeling a bit tense. It was a complex order in an unstable region. The client named a sum that suited me just fine. "When is the deadline?" I inquired again. "There's no specific deadline, as soon as possible, but don't rush it too much," he replied. "But I have unfinished business here." I poured myself and my guest some more whiskey. "Do you need help?" My guest crossed his legs. "It seems like I do," I replied. I took a sip of whiskey and began to explain my problem. "Please, damn it. You barely have time to recover from one blow, and then you get hit again. It's like walking through a dense forest, blindfolded at night. It's scary to open your eyes. Suddenly, you might bump into a branch and lose an eye. So all hope is in your hands. You cover your face with one hand and reach out with the other, so you don't run into a tree trunk with your forehead or nose. Have you seen a children's carousel? Everything goes in circles. Horses, reindeer, goats. They all return to the beginning. And then they start all over again, endlessly. Maybe carousel animals think they're moving forward, but in reality, they're running in a closed loop. That's life. All events in it repeat with enviable consistency. Someone once said that life is a spiral. Everything in it develops progressively. Unfortunately, that's not the case, at least not for me. Several years ago, I fell in love with a girl who happened to cross my path by chance. Her name was Natasha. Just naming her made a sweet yearning spread throughout my body. It's been so many years, but I can't forget it all. I thought she felt something for me too. But maybe that was just wishful thinking on my part. I had to leave urgently back then. There was a matter I couldn't postpone. I left her the keys and asked her to wait for me. She promised to wait as long as it took. As it took, she spoke beautiful words about love and faithfulness. But when I returned, she was gone. In the mailbox, there were only the house keys and nothing else. No response, no greetings. She didn't even leave a note. I searched for her for almost a year, but eventually gave up my job, rallied all my friends, and used all my connections. But Natasha had vanished without a trace. I combed through all the morgues and hospitals, psychiatric wards, and prisons, but it was in vain. There were no clues. Gitchness at a drunken delirium, I even convinced myself that she came from outer space. There was simply no other explanation. For another year, I struggled to get back on my feet. I never thought you could love a woman so much, especially one who is nothing out of the ordinary. She didn't possess model looks or outstanding charisma, just an ordinary girl, of which there are many. But somehow without her, life felt empty. Time went on, and gradually, her image started to blur. Life, in any case, dictates its own rules. I slowly began to return to a normal state. Orders started coming in again, and where there's money, sooner or later, women get involved. That's how Ala came onto my horizon, a young, beautiful party-goer. She clung to me like a vice. We met at some party dedicated to I can't remember what. I wasn't particularly chasing after women. I poured my own drinks and gradually got drunk. The day before, I'd returned from another business trip, and I had money. Drunk, I was searching for a reason to leave as quickly as possible. Being among the office drones and shallow girls with fake breasts and only one brain cell was unbearable. But at some point, a young woman of the opposite sex landed next to me. Without getting into unnecessary arguments, she skillfully poured wine into my glass without forgetting herself. "Why are you so sad?" she asked after we had a drink. But I shrugged my shoulders. I didn't really feel like talking. "Such a handsome guy, and all alone," the girl persisted. "I'm away, by the way." "And you." That's when I knew it was going to be tough. That's the first thing that crossed my mind. I absolutely had no desire to let loose and start a mating dance. But the girl didn't give up easily. Seeing that her efforts to charm me weren't very effective, she shifted to a different strategy. What a silly party. She began from afar, pouring me more wine. It feels strange to be lonely in a crowd. "Why did you just leave then?" I lethargically muttered. "Pull a taxi and go." "My phone's dead." Ala looked at me hopefully. "Sure, if you want, I can help you," I said. Those were fateful words. I only realized that much later. Just another glass of wine, and there I was sitting in a taxi next to Ale. Oh, she wasn't clinging to me. She didn't get overly intimate. She sat gracefully next to me, just like a caring friend. Then it turned out she had forgotten her money. I paid the driver and went up to her so she could repay me. It all seemed scripted, as if the debt couldn't wait, be paid later, or even forgiven. I was already quite drunk and having a hard time perceiving reality. In the morning, I woke up in bed with Allah. I felt no revulsion. Well, if it happened, let it be. No Allah, but some other girlfriend. It made absolutely no difference. 2 months later, he got married. The wedding wasn't very big, but elegant, with important guests and a small family. We started living in my house. All the property was mine, the store and the antique business as well. We didn't sign a prenuptial agreement, but in case of anything, it was impossible for her to claim anything. Except for the car I had given her, but that was just a drop in the bucket. Though we didn't have any children. Allah didn't rush, and I didn't insist, as I had a feeling about something. But my wife fully immersed herself in high society life. Friends, parties, gatherings. But no signs of infidelity. She was always home on time. Her phone was always on. In our time together, no one ever raised any doubts about Ali's behavior in public without me. And then here it comes. It's an affair with the market director, Thomas. Honestly, I didn't understand why. I was younger than her lover, and I didn't deny her anything. Sex almost every day. What was she missing? I didn't delve into the moral and psychological aspects of married life. Most women, you can never understand them. They say they sometimes don't understand themselves. But the fact of infidelity was as clear as day. Of course I was upset, but not like after Natasha's disappearance. There was hurt mixed with bewilderment, that slight pain in the heart and soul, and it was like finding out that you had lived with an empty person for several years, pouring the warmth of your soul into them. They say there's a very thin line between love and hate. Maybe that's true. I was more than surprised when I realized that the love I still had for Ale was just a flickering flame that quickly extinguished in the following days. Well, in the end, the bachelor life suited me better. I filed for divorce and started preparing for a trip down south. But it wasn't that simple. Ola had decided to claim half of my business and the house. It's long been known that lawyers can do anything, but for a hefty fee. My ex-wife didn't have that kind of money, so her lover got involved. It's hard to say what motivated them, but it certainly wasn't great love. It was more likely a desire for revenge against me for humiliation and a bruised face. 2 days later, an attorney representing Ala contacted me and informed me that they were filing a lawsuit for property division. I understood that legally they didn't stand a chance, so they would use other methods of persuasion, and I seemed to know what those methods were. A week later, Ala's cunning lair arranged a meeting to discuss, as he put it, the disputed matters. As I expected, my own lawyer was a witness, not so much to help me, but to be a witness. It seemed like the meeting was planned to intimidate me and force me to share my property and money with the poor abandoned woman. I decided to play the fool to better understand their cunning plans. Ala outdid herself. She wore all black, looked mournful, and put on a veil. She acted as if she were grieving the destroyed family. All my fault. Her lawyer did most of the talking. He went on and on about Ale's unfortunate fate, how she had stumbled, and about forgiveness. Finally, he got to the point and sweetly proposed to divide my business and other assets as compensation for the best years of my wife's life spent with me. He made a face that left no doubt in my mind about what would happen to me if I refused. I sat there in silence, occasionally blinking my eyes, pretending to be a complete idiot. Even my lawyer shook his head doubtfully and tried to argue with the lawyer. But the lawyer immediately silenced him and looked expectantly at me. I stood up, shook off my full persona, and said just one word. Now, as I walked out of the meeting room, I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the lawyer dialing someone's number on his iPhone. In the evening, they came to my house, 2 burly guys and a law's lawyer. My security guard escorted them to my office. Of course, having security in my house had somewhat surprised the cunning lawyer. He didn't expect such resistance from me. However, he quickly got down to business. He spent nearly an hour scaring me with all sorts of consequences of my refusal. He didn't directly threaten me, though. I endured his tirade and sent him on his way. From everything I heard, I understood that I needed to strike a preemptive blow and end this circus. I looked at my wristwatch. midnight. The owner was running late. Silence. His family was visiting their homeland, so no one would interrupt us. I shifted in the armchair. I felt like smoking, but the smoke would give me away. Nothing to be done. I would have to do without a cigarette for now. I heard the sound of a car approaching from the street. Finally, the front door slammed shut, and heavy footsteps echoed. The door opened, and a bulky figure in a black coat burst into the room. I saw Thomas's hand reaching for the light switch. No need to turn on the lights. My words sounded like the voice of an angel on Judgment Day. The fat man froze and slowly turned towards me. "Who are you?" He managed to squeeze these words out with difficulty. The horse in a coat. I couldn't resist making a joke. "Sit down, let's talk." I pointed to the chair across from me. Thomas correctly understood my gesture and slowly sank into the chair. Gradually, he began to regain his composure. For about 20 minutes, I listened to what fate had in store for me for breaking into his house. He even tried to call security, but no one came at his cry for help. Then it was my turn to speak. I won't recount my monologue. It was brief. The essence of it was that if he ever crossed my path again, I would cut off. No, not what you're thinking. Just his head. As I said those words, I turned on the floor lamp, and Thomas saw right in front of him, on the coffee table, his beloved marble dog Hector's severed head, oozing with blood. Hector was just as fat as his owner. You should have seen the terror in my wife's lover's eyes. It seemed like he had swallowed his tongue out of fear. The silent scene lasted for about a minute. Then he got a phone call. Thomas, with trembling hands, took out his phone. I quickly snatched it from him and put it on speaker. Someone in a panic informed the market director that food warehouses were burning. I looked at Tomas. It seemed like I was more than convincing. I could have blown up his car as a final touch, but that would have been going too far. I got up and left, leaving the owner to admire his beloved dog's head. Picking through the dark corridor, I had to step over the bodies of the security guards, knocked out with a stun gun, lying in picturesque poses. Two dark figures detached themselves from the wall. "Let's go," I said quietly. "How's the dog sleeping without its hind legs?" The man in black smirked. "And you thought I really killed the dog? Of course not, I love animals. But admit it, a rubber head can also make an impression." The divorce went smoothly. I was alone in court, and the whole process took little time. Right, to make a business trip successful, preparation is key. Scour the internet, visit the library. Not everything you need for work can be found online. Wikipedia is nothing more than a big virtual garbage dump where anyone dumps unchecked junk. But I didn't need unreliable data and information. My life was on the line, so there was no room for error. Thus, on a frosty winter evening, it seemed endless. Pushing aside Geller's reference book on antique Eastern silver, I indulged myself with a Cuban cigar, sinking into the corner of an old leather sofa. Past the dark lampshade of the floor lamp cast a sharply defined circle of light on the floor, while the rest of the room remained in semi-darkness. Outside, the frost was cracking, and the fluffy snow on the flower bed shimmered like silver under the still full moon. I didn't feel lonely. I always found something to occupy myself, especially when I was preparing for another expedition. And honestly, I didn't want any company. From my neighbors, I was a stranger. I disappeared for long periods and reappeared. They probably had no idea what I did for a living. And that was good. The less they knew, the better they slept. I exhaled a puff of smoke, put the unfinished cigar in an antique brass ashtray, got up, and went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of whiskey, 3 fingers high, dropped in a few ice cubes, and took a big sip. And at that moment, the intercom rang. The old ship's clock showed it was already 11:30 in the evening. I wondered who could be coming at this late hour. Reluctantly, I approached the intercom. Race on the screen, dimly lit by a street lamp. I saw a woman standing near my gate. She was dressed in a dark coat and had a scarf wrapped around her head, covering her up to her eyes. She didn't resemble anyone I knew. I wondered who she could be. "To whom are you looking for?" I asked into the intercom microphone, taking a sip of whiskey. "I need the owner." The woman replied clearly, leaning her ungloved hand on the brick fence. I had more questions, but suddenly I felt sorry for keeping a stranger out in the cold, so I opened the gate. "Ansi, come in." Hook on the security camera, I watched as the woman, swaying slightly, made her way to the front porch. "Is she drunk?" was my first thought. It's the woman, with some effort, climbed the steps and stood in front of the front door. "Hello. May I come in?" The unexpected guest said quietly. "Come into the hallway." I led her into the house and closed the door behind her. "No, she doesn't seem drunk." The woman hesitated in the brightly lit hallway, gazing at me with large, curious, and slightly wary blue eyes. "Take off your coat and give me your scarf." The stranger removed her slightly snow-covered artificial fur coat, revealing a woolen dress of an indistinct color that hugged her well-proportioned, petite figure. She unwrapped the worn-down scarf and was looking around for a coat hanger. I finally regained my composure and politely took her clothing, carefully placing it on hangers. She then took off her boots and looked at me questioningly. For a moment, I lost my ability to speak. Before me stood a charming young woman. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why was she here? These questions swirled in my mind, but I couldn't find any answers. I had few female acquaintances in this city, especially one so enchanting. It stood silently for a while, trying not to look her in the eyes. That's the pause seemed to stretch on. "Please sit down," I finally said. "Restuchin, I'll make you some hot tea." The young woman continued into the hall, looking around with curiosity. She stopped by the rug with the weapons, silently examining the deadly steel concealed in the pile for a moment. Then she glanced at me, smiled, and eventually took a seat on the couch after straightening her dress. Leaving my guest in the hall, I went to the kitchen, heated the kettle, poured boiling water into the teapot, found a few biscuits, and neatly arranged everything on the coffee table. The woman carefully picked up a cup, took a polite sip, and then looked at me. "So how can I assist you?" He asked politely. "Are you Yuri Koltsov?" The stranger asked, placing her cup of hot tea on the saucer. "That's absolutely correct." "How may I help you?" Words, I responded in a refined tone, even feeling like I was extending my tail in front of the stranger. My name's Galina Verasova, she said, raising her blue eyes to meet mine. Do you remember Natasha? Person or experience, I choked on my surprise. Nersha, as my heart betrayed me and began to race. Love might change a person, but it never dies. It can lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to make your heart beat faster. But I had indeed changed. New thoughts, views, passions, sorrows, and joys. Sometimes I missed my old self, but it was impossible to turn back the clock, and there was no point in doing so. Staycation, I lit a cigarette and opened a small window. Outside, the freezing winter night was bathed in moonlight, and the snow glistened like silver. Inside, the hallway was warm. The fire crackled in the corner, occasionally sending sparks dancing into the air. However, an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. Forgive me, but how old are you? I asked the guest somewhat tactlessly. Does not matter. Galina shrugged, her gaze unwavering. You still haven't answered my question. She looked at me attentively. Yes, I remember Natasha. She lived here for a while, and then disappeared, leaving no note. I said, leaning back in my chair. Memories of Natasha brought pain. I searched for her, but in vain. That's all then. I added, I wasn't planning to bare my soul to a stranger. Even though she hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue, the girl finally spoke. She struggled to find the right words and said, You couldn't have found her. Before she met you, Natasha was dating a guy named Arthur. They were about to get married, and even had rings. But then she met you, and Natasha lost her head. She fell in love with you. When you left, she patiently waited. However, her aunt, who's also your housekeeper, came and kicked Natasha out. She had no choice but to return home. Arthur found out she had returned, tracked her down, and severely beat her. Her family at home also mistreated her, calling her a city whore. One day, Arthur came to their house and proposed to marry her again. Natasha had no way out, so she agreed. When she found out she was pregnant, she thought it was Arthur's child. For nearly a year and a half, they lived somewhat tolerably together. Then Arthur started scrutinizing the baby, trying to find any resemblance to himself. Doubt crept into his mind, and he became convinced the child wasn't his. He had a DNA test done, and the truth was revealed. That night, he beat Natasha again, calling her all sorts of names like monster whore and tramp. He took all her valuables, including her engagement ring. He continued to abuse her almost every day. She couldn't take it anymore. One day, when Arthur was at work, Natasha took the child and came to live with me, her cousin. I was renting a room in a communal apartment. Arthur didn't make any effort to find her. A month later, he filed for divorce, and Natasha didn't object. The three of us lived together for almost 2 months. Natasha didn't work, and we all lived on my salary, but there was a catastrophic shortage of money. Then Natasha decided to go to the capital to earn money. She left the child with me and left. She couldn't take her daughter with her because she had nowhere to go. Before she left, she told me about you and that the child was yours. I had a little money, so I bought her a ticket to Kiev. Later, Natasha wrote that she had found a job as a waitress in a cafe. There, she met Valdis. He was studying in Kiev and taking his final exams this year. Valdis started courting her. They knew how to sweep naive girls off their feet. He promised to marry her and suggested going to Latvia to visit his parents. After that, there were no more letters from Natasha. I don't know where she is now or what happened to her. But I couldn't help but wonder why she didn't try to find me, especially if the child was mine. She knew I had returned. When she ran away from Arthur, she came to see you. However, she was met by a young woman who introduced herself as your wife. She chased Natasha away and threatened to involve the police if she ever tried to contact you again. Police, if she ever showed up again, Galia took a sip from her cup. When Natasha got married, she changed her last name. That's why you couldn't find her. I was in a daze for a while. Where's the child now? I asked, regaining my composure. She's with me. I left her with an acquaintance to avoid dragging her out, and the cold Galia sighed heavily. I wouldn't have done it, but I was laid off a month ago due to downsizing. There's nothing for us to live on with Vera. She covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Honestly, I was in shock. I had no reason to disbelieve the guest. Everything she told me made sense. What do you want from me? I asked Galia. I want to ask you for some money. Just a little to get us through the initial period. We'll go back home and won't bother you anymore. Galia spoke quickly, as if afraid I would kick her out. I was promised a job. She didn't finish her sentence. I understood. There was no job in sight. Do you want something to eat? I unexpectedly asked. What? I said, "Do you want something to eat?" She looked at me in surprise. "Let's go to the kitchen, have a snack, and then we'll go get Vera." I called a taxi, and we drove to the outskirts of the city. Galia's friend rented a room in an old house, buried under a pile of junk, poorly heated. There, we found a little girl. She clung to Galia, hugging her around the neck with her tiny hands. "I want to eat," the child whimpered softly. Galia affectionately stroked the child's head. I tried to pick up Vera, but she screamed in fear and clung even tighter to Galia. When we returned home, I prepared dinner with Galia's help, as I had no idea what a small child could eat. Then, I showed them to the bedroom and put them to bed. I woke up early the next morning. I made coffee, poured myself a large cup, and sat down in the kitchen. Overnight, I had made a decision, and now I was waiting for Galia to wake up. Did I believe her? Yes and no. At least I had decided to do a DNA test. We would see where that led. I didn't call my mother. She already had her hands full with Kataya, my niece, and I didn't want to worry her. Galia walked into the kitchen. I poured her coffee and pushed a plate of toast toward her. "As soon as Vera wakes up, we'll leave." She adjusted her dress. "Thank you." The tears welled up in her eyes again. Why do women always cry at the drop of a hat? All right then. As for your job, it's hard to predict what will happen. But in any case, we need to figure out a plan for the future, I said. We need to feed and clothe the child. If you don't mind, I'd like to hire you as a housekeeper. You'll live here with the child. Consider the money I gave you as an advance. I placed a card in front of her. This is for groceries and clothing. Buy everything you and the child need. Do you have a mobile phone? Galia shook her head in the negative. I pushed a box with a new iPhone towards her. Will you manage on your own? He asked. She nodded quickly. My phone and the driver's phone are already programmed in there. If you need to go anywhere, just call and they'll pick you up. As soon as Vera wakes up and has breakfast, we'll go to the laboratory and submit the DNA test material. I'll be leaving soon, and I want to know the results before I go. I said all of this in one breath. So any objections? Galia shook her head in the negative. 6 days later, the DNA test results were ready. I wasn't the girl's father. Galia read the test results and looked up at me. Oh my God, what do we do now? She said helplessly, Don't think we're leaving right away. I'm sorry, I never thought this could happen. I was sure that Vera was your daughter. She placed the card on the table and went upstairs to get Vera. Wait, I slapped my hand on the table. What has actually changed? I still need a housekeeper. Moreover, I may be leaving for a while. By the way, Elizabeth Pavlovna is coming today. She will stay with you while I'm away. Galia, you and the child will be fine. The girl looked at me in astonishment. So can I stay? She stammered. Of course you work for me. Everything remains the same. I chuckled. Yes, history repeats itself. Several years ago, I bid farewell to my beloved and asked her to wait for me. The circle has closed. I was about to get into a taxi when Galia asked to go with me to the airport. I didn't object. As I went through the flight check-in and headed towards passport control, Galia unexpectedly kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "Come back soon." After passing through immigration, I turned around. Two girls, one big and one small, were waving at me. I could see tears in Galia's eyes. After a 6-hour flight, the plane safely landed at the airport of one of the Central Asian republics. As soon as I completed all the post-flight formalities and entered the arrival hall, my gaze caught a familiar face in the dense crowd. Hudelbeck, I had no doubt that he would be the one to greet me. I raised my hand to signal that I spotted him. I spotted my old friend, Assalamu alaikum. Brother Ulekbek, dressed in a long camel wool robe and a tuba taika, embraced me. Long time no see. Hello, Ulekbek. I genuinely rejoiced at the reunion. It's been almost 5 years. Let's go. I have a car. Ulekbek picked up my bag, and we headed towards the airport exit. After winding through the narrow streets of the ancient southern city, our car finally entered through narrow gates and stopped in the shade of a keener tree. A young woman, who quickly set up the Testarkhan, covering her face, bowed and then disappeared into the house. Oleg said something to her, in an unfamiliar language. She bowed again and vanished inside. Did she get married? I glanced at the woman and turned to my friend. No, why would you think that? Oloktek took off his robe and casually tossed it next to the cushions. But I'm not an old man, am I? I didn't delve into that topic further. We settled around a low table covered with a colorful tablecloth. The young woman poured tea into pilas and disappeared into the house again. Quite the upbringing, Ulubek commented. We then spent a long time eating, washing down the food with aromatic tea. Ulubek inquired about the health of my loved ones. He was deeply saddened when he learned about the circumstances of my younger brother's death. Did you get your revenge? He asked me. Yes, I replied succinctly, as is customary for me. My friend nodded approvingly. Dusk began to fall. The hot southern sun slowly disappeared below the horizon, and the heat started to subside. Soon, we heard the muezzin's call to the Maghrib prayer. It seemed there was a mosque nearby. While Ulubek performed his threefold prayer, I managed to drink 2 cups of aromatic tea. When it was completely dark, the silent woman lit several lanterns, illuminating our seating area. From the darkness around us, the loud chirping of cicadas and the rustling of bat wings reached our ears. Pretty nearby, there are the ruins of an ancient tower, Ulubek said, as if reading my thoughts. There are many bats there. They hunt at night and sometimes fly in here. We finally got down to business. I briefly explained the essence of the problem to my friend without going into too many details. There was no need to burden a good man with unnecessary information, especially since I would have to do the work anyway. There's no point in going to Merv. Everything valuable has already been taken from there, Ulubek commented after chewing his lips. Faith crossing the river is dangerous. The bandits are rampant there now. They gave the Americans a hard time, and they will soon take control of the entire country. We should head southeast to the Gemma Valley. There might still be something to find there. And you can search here as well. I nodded in agreement. There were very few caravan trails through the country beyond the river, so it was unlikely that anything of value could be found there. But in the Jamara Valley, you can search. There may be coins and silverware. Just what I need. I'll look here, maybe I'll find something. After a pause, Ulubek continued, Well, Ainu, take my car equipment, weapons, and head for the southeast. You'll pick up your car papers and weapons per minute tomorrow. He shouted something into the darkness and a light came on in the doorway. Let's go inside. We need to rest. Ulubek pushed me with his hand towards the house. The silent woman led me into a small room with a bed and a small table. On the table stood a copper basin and a pitcher of water. I nodded in response, though I understood nothing. From the surprise, I lost the ability to resist. And everything happened. There was no disappointment. The warm southern night, soaked with love and oriental pleasures, did its job. When the naked young woman with a quiet groan was in my arms, answering me with kisses, then timidly, then passionately, a calm and peacefulness was born in my soul for the first time in a while. And when I fell asleep, tenderly embracing the submissive female body and remembering Ulubek's words, I am not an old man. My conscience was calm. I was awakened by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ulubek sat beneath the chenara tree, squinting at the rising sun, holding a cup of hot drink in his hand. I quickly washed up and joined my old friend. How was your rest? Ulubek asked after taking a sip of coffee, looking at me. The main. I haven't slept like that in a long time, I replied, trying to discern the underlying meaning in his words. He seemed to read my thoughts. It was Amina, the widow of my friend Basim. Her husband disappeared somewhere in the desert a year ago. Fortunately, they had no children. She's living in my house now. It seems she took a liking to you at first sight, Ulubek added in his own language. I lowered my gaze. Well, in the end, it was her choice. We had another cup of coffee. Finally, Ulubek pushed a large canvas bag toward me. At the top, covered with a mesh shawl and with an attached magazine, lay an Aksu. I felt 2 fully loaded magazines on the side. 3 should be sufficient, Ulubek commented. They're not going to war. Inside the bag, there was also a knife with a long, wide blade and an old artillery binocular, wrapped in a desert-patterned sniper cloth. At the very bottom of the bag, I found a familiar Colt, a 1911 model, along with a spare magazine of ammunition. Look, your documents, provisions, and everything else are in the car. You can sort it out later, Ulubek said as he stood up. May Allah watch over you? The ornate door creaked, and in its frame appeared Amina. Paying no attention to Ulubek, she rushed toward me and hugged me passionately. As I departed the city, the haunting call of the muezzin echoed in the distance. The car sped along the sun-baked highway, splitting the red sands into almost equal halves. The road had been paved along an ancient caravan route back in old times. The thermometer on the dashboard displayed plus 47 degrees Celsius. The engine strained, pushing its limits. The temperature gauge steadily approached the 100 mark. I sat in the driver's seat, wearing a warm robe with only swim trunks underneath. It was the only way to escape the heat, even if only briefly. Mountain peaks occasionally appeared on the horizon, and I could no longer discern whether they were real mountains or a mirage. This path was dying, fewer and fewer cars traversed the desert, the asphalt withered from the heat, and the few remaining gas stations rusted on the road's shoulder. All due to the heat, which consumed everything living, making the vast desert even larger. Its sands stretched all the way to the Aral Sea. I remembered how Uluk had once told me that in his childhood, gardens flourished in these parts and rivers flowed abundantly. Now all of that was in the past, and the only source of moisture was the seasonal, short-lived rains, which had long been losing their unequal battle with the scorching heat. The sun relentlessly descended toward the horizon, still mercilessly scorching the dry air. The desert wind swept the tops of sand dunes, tossing hot sand onto the road. The day was drawing to a close, and I realized I would have to spend the night in the car. The only comforting thought was that with the sunset, the heat would abate, allowing me to breathe more freely. The crimson sun was almost touching the horizon when I veered off the highway onto a relatively flat patch of ground. I turned off the exhausted engine and began unpacking my belongings. I unfolded the seats and laid out my sleeping bag. I retrieved a gas stove and a canister, as I had no appetite but was tormented by thirst. I quickly lit the stove and placed a brass kettle on it, filling it with tea leaves. In such heat, the locals preferred strong green tea called Coke chai. While the brew was simmering, I retrieved the rifle from my bag, loaded a round into the chamber, engaged the safety, and placed it on the seat beside me. For many kilometers in every direction, there was no sign of habitation. I felt as though I was in outer space, but one had to be prepared for any unexpected encounters. Soon, I was sitting on the hood, covered with a camel hair blanket, sipping hot tea to quench my thirst. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew, clouds began to obscure the sky. A neon flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, and a moment later, thunder roared directly overhead. I watched as raindrops streaked across the sky. I even prepared to take cover in the cabin. However, the downpour did not reach the parched earth. It evaporated in the air. Only a few warm drops managed to reach the ground and landed on my face. In mockery, the wind flung a handful of sand in my face. The clouds slowly receded to the north, and one by one, stars began to twinkle in the sky, forming meaningless constellations. I had trouble falling asleep. Various thoughts invaded my mind, but gradually fatigue took over and I slipped into slumber. I was awakened by a noise, and the car rocked several times. I abruptly opened my eyes and looked out the window. There was an impenetrable darkness outside. What could it have been? Maybe a snake. But how large should it be to rock the car like that? Suddenly, a wave of black panic and uncontrollable fear overwhelmed my mind. My body felt as if it had turned to stone. I took a deep hysterical breath, arching my back. Next, with an incredible effort of will, I forced myself to find a flashlight and turn it on. Its light trembled, pushing back the darkness. It revealed the same lifeless desert all around me. I sat there, drenched in sweat, feeling my heart about to burst from my chest, my rapid breathing drowning out all other sounds. Gradually, I started to regain my composure. The panic subsided, and my thoughts stopped racing like frenzied cockroaches. I wiped the sweat from my face with my robe's sleeve and took a deep breath. Maybe it was just a dream. I tried to reassure myself. Scanning the dimly lit desert, I noticed something black, swiftly dissolving into the darkness. I remembered the rifle and placed it next to me. It was a small caliber, but still. Besides, I had the Colt .45 caliber, a pocket cannon. Holding the weapon in my hands, I began to regain my senses. I took a sip of whiskey for courage and fell silent, listening intently to the night. There were more noises again. Somewhere nearby, sand hissed and scattered quietly, but the car remained still. I drifted back to sleep. They say that in the most desolate sandy regions of Central Asia, the Algoi kurkoi dwells. It is a 1-meter-long earthworm, dark red in color. It only surfaces during the hottest months. The local population holds a mystical fear of the Algoi kurkoi, believing it can kill from a distance, either by spitting lethal venom or by delivering an electric shock. The legend of the Algoi kurkoi is so widespread and uniform that it is likely based on some extremely rare, endangered creature, possibly a relic from ancient times that survives in the most remote corners of Central Asia. Here, in the Red Sands, as Ulubu Bek once told me, they also claim to have seen the Algoi kurkoi. He mentioned the creature appeared only during the hottest months, in June and July, before burrowing back into the earth to hibernate. Locals were convinced that the creature had not disappeared and periodically claimed human lives. Several expeditions were sent to search for the Algoi Korkoi in the most remote areas of Central Asia. In 1954, American scientists were operating in the Inner Mongolia region. They left the settlement in 2 Land Rovers and disappeared without a trace. At the request of the US government, Mongolian authorities organized a search. The missing individuals were found in one of the remote regions of the Gobi Desert. Both cars were in working order and nearby lay 6 bodies. It wasn't due to prolonged exposure to the sun. The exact cause of death of the expedition members could not be determined. It is believed that they fell victim to the Algoi Korkoi. In the 1970s, 2 Soviet expeditions ventured to Red Sands to attempt to capture the elusive creature. However, they were unable to capture it. Nevertheless, they gathered numerous pieces of evidence supporting its existence. The results of these expeditions were never published and were soon forgotten, except by the local residents. I abruptly opened my eyes again, greeted by the twilight. It seemed it was still early, but the heat had already given way to the night's coolness. I tried to remember the dream, but it had already slipped away, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. As I drove further into the desert, the road deteriorated. The lifeless landscape on both sides of the highway was profoundly disheartening. According to my calculations, I should reach my destination by evening. The Jamara Valley lay between the mountains, which had already appeared on the horizon. In the distance, my eyes caught a white dot. I stopped the car and pulled out my binoculars. Through the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt, it was hard to make out the vehicle. There didn't seem to be anyone around. I decided to get closer. I couldn't go around it anyway. Sand was all around, and my car could easily get stuck. The closer I got, the louder the alarm bells rang in my head. Something was not right. Just to be on the safe side, I moved the rifle closer, removing the safety. A white Toyota was parked, its nose buried in a pile of sand that had blown onto the road. Inside the cabin, a man sat motionless, his head dropped onto the steering wheel. His left arm hung limply by his side, and he couldn't see what was on the right. Slightly to the left, almost in the middle of the road, lay a woman dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. She, too, showed no signs of life. It seemed as though she had been trying to escape from someone. The question was, why had she jumped out of the car? Perhaps she was trying to get away from the driver. I didn't rush to turn off the engine and exit the car. My brain was working intensely, analyzing the situation. How long had I been here? No one had overtaken me, so they must have been here before me, at least for a day. Heck in your teachings. On such a hot day, rigor mortis would set in more slowly. But still, it was evident that the bodies were not fresh. They looked as if they had just come out of the shower. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the driver's hand, which had been hanging motionless by his side, barely twitch. Doubt shattered like grenade fragments. It was an ambush. I shifted into first gear, simultaneously lowering the right window. The car lurched forward, maneuvering around the woman lying on the ground. There was one thought piercing through my mind, not to get stuck in the sand. With my right hand, I raised the rifle and fired a short burst directly at the Toyota's driver. I could see the bullets piercing his body. He twitched a few times, like a rag doll on a string, and tumbled out of the cabin. It seemed he was now truly dead. A pistol fell from his right hand onto the sand, but I couldn't make out the model. At on the left side of the road, an automatic burst rang out. I could hear the bullets striking the side of my car. I pressed the gas pedal, and then it happened, my worst fear. The car came to a stop, stuck in the sandy drift. I opened the left door and rolled onto the sand, shooting as I went. In response, a hail of bullets struck the ground near me. My left forearm was grazed, and I felt the blood trickling. But my arm still worked. This meant the bullets had just grazed me. I pinpointed the direction of the gunfire, struggling to keep the rifle steady despite the pain in my arm. I fired a short burst in the direction of the attacker. I didn't know how many bullets I had left. There was no way to reach the spare magazine. All that was left was the woman. In the silence, all I could hear was the crunch of sand under heavy boots. I leaned against the car, bringing the rifle to bear, and waited. It was like a game now. Who would make the next move? Finally, I saw a shadow emerge from behind the car. The sun was shining in their back. The sand rustled, and a head with a baseball cap appeared. My rifle jerked, expelling the last cartridge, and the woman's lifeless body fell at my feet. The same one that had been lying on the road for several minutes. I sat motionless, waiting for another attack, but all's quiet. I slowly crawled into the seat and turned the ignition key. The engine started instantly. Everything was normal. I carefully backed up, then took a slight right and drove through the sand to stop the car. I dressed the wound first. It hurt, but I had to bear it. The wound wasn't dangerous, but I gave myself a shot of anesthetic just in case. I didn't touch the bodies. After a couple of days, they would be gone. There were a lot of dead people around here. I checked the Toyota, but I didn't find anything. There were 3 characters, all lying in the sand, showing no signs of life. I picked up the gun that had fallen out of the driver's hand. It was a Beretta 96, a good gun. I shoved the trophy with a full magazine behind my pants belt and walked to my car. Soon, a bleak desert landscape stretched on both sides of the Skoa Road. After about 60 kilometers, some buildings appeared ahead. As I got closer, I realized that it was an old, miraculously preserved caravanserai. I drove leisurely under the arch and found myself in the courtyard where a small water fountain once stood in the center. I got out of the car and walked under the shadow of one of the arches. There were no people in sight. If there were, they were hiding from the burning sun inside. But the yard was well maintained, and where the wall was cracked or chipped, someone had reapplied fresh clay which had dried quickly under the fierce light. I looked around the buildings, but there were no people. Maybe no one lives here all the time. Maybe they come here sometimes. The question is, why? As in, and these buildings have outlived their usefulness. Maybe it's a staging area. In one of the rooms, I found some antique jugs. Mostly brass, but there were a couple of silver ones. I threw them in the car. I had to drive to get to the valley by daylight. Finally, the road came to the mountains. It meandered between the rocks until it came to a babbling mountain stream. It got cooler. Instead of dunes, there were trees along the road. I realized I had reached my goal. An hour later, I entered a small village. But there was electricity, and most importantly, a bazaar. That's where I was going tomorrow morning. I stayed in a small hotel proudly called Hotel. The room had a shower and a toilet. What more could a traveler want? I ate some dry rations and went to bed. I was exhausted. I bought something for myself. The day after the trip turned out to be more than successful. I had to fill up the car and 2 more cans of gasoline before setting off on the return trip. I spent the night on the way again, but it was peaceful. By the end of the second day, I was already entering Ludbeck's yard. He did not meet me empty-handed either. I gave him everything I had brought. The delivery of the cargo did not concern me as specially trained people were in charge of it. When I told Lubeck about my adventures, he clucked his tongue for a long time, expressing either approval or condemnation of my frivolity. Then we drank Church and I went to bed. After spending the night in Amina's arms, I went to the airport in the morning, accompanied by a friend. I did not say goodbye to Amina. As they say, long farewells bring tears. I had a few coins and a couple of funny souvenirs I found in an abandoned caravanserai with me. We hugged in silence. I saw a mute question in Lubeck's eyes and I knew what it was. I like her very much, but I am a vagabond, a wanderer by life. So it's better not to have a family yet. I shook the hand extended to me. I thought for a moment and then took off my talisman from my neck, given to me by my grandfather, and gave it to a Lubeck. Give it to Amina as a memento, I said. My hometown greeted me with cold wind and nasty spring rain, a stark contrast to the places I had flown from. No one greeted me because I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I picked up my car in the underground parking lot and took a leisurely drive home. In the 2 weeks I had been gone, the snow had almost melted, leaving piles of black mud along the sides of the highway. It had frozen overnight, and now the car was almost sliding on the ice, churning up water. The wipers rhythmically swept the raindrops off the windshield. I lit a cigarette, blowing the blue smoke through the half-open window. I felt dreary. Too many women had been around me lately, but for some reason, the memories of the last one splashed in my soul. Brisamina. Yes, she was the one who had captured my heart, but alas, I'll never meet her again. Most likely, Lubeck will marry her off to some respectable gentleman. I can only wish her happiness. An hour later, I arrived at the ring road, and after a while, I pulled up to my house. When I tried to open the front gate, the key didn't work. That's strange. I had recently changed the lock, and everything was perfect. I got out of the car and pressed the intercom button. I was tired from the road, and all I wanted was to drink whiskey and sleep. Like an unfamiliar male voice answered me. I was even a little taken aback. "I need to get into the house," I said. In a minute, the gate opened. A middle-aged man stood in the doorway. "What do you want?" he asked. "The owners are still asleep. Get out of here." He tried to slam the gate in my face, but my brain went into automatic mode, and I came to my senses when the guard flew aside, hitting his head on the brick fence. Yeah, you can't beat skill, I thought to myself as I carefully stepped over the man's leg stretched across the path and headed for the front door. The glass door was unlocked, so I made my way into the hallway and carefully set my bag down beside the couch. I wondered if there were any other owners out there. I hadn't rented or sold the house, so maybe Alea and her monkey had shown up again. I wasn't angry, just surprised. I went into the kitchen and noticed that the fridge was mine, but the tea set belonged to someone else. "It's too bright," I muttered to myself. "I don't like those." I opened the cupboard and saw that the dishes were all mixed up. Mine and someone else's, but only china. The antique brass that looked so beautiful behind the glass was gone. I made coffee and went back to the lobby, where I had to wait for the owners to wake up. I must have dozed off because I didn't hear them come in. Suddenly, a loud voice woke me up. A man in a green satin robe was hovering over me, rolling his eyes in surprise. An unfamiliar young woman stood next to him, her long fingers with blood-red nails frantically typing something on her iPhone. "I'm actually in my house," I said loudly. "Who the hell are you?" The man replied, "Who's who? We bought this house and moved in 3 days ago. The owner and her child went to her husband up north and sold the house to us." The man was seething with righteous anger. The owner is a young woman named Galia, and the girl's name is Vera, about 4 years old. I was beginning to realize what had happened. Galia even let her tear at the airport, like, "Come back soon." She also tried to slip me a baby. She did it fast. Everything was so banal that it made me laugh. It's true what they say. You shouldn't let strangers into your house. I can imagine her laughing at me when she left with the money. I went into the study without arguing, pushed aside the painting hanging on the wall, and opened the door of the secret safe. I took out the deed to the house and said, "Here you go. The house has one owner, and I'm not married." The man replied, "I'll give you 1 hour to get out of here. I'm getting tired of this," and put the dishes back where they belong. "We bought this house, and we're not going anywhere. Forget out. If you have a problem with it, sue me." The man was almost yelling. "Nina, did you call the police?" Well, God knows I did everything I could. I stood up and grabbed the man's nose with my right hand. Without giving them a second thought, I threw him out the unlocked door and into the street. While he was splashing in the rain trying to get up, I walked over to his wife. "Get out." I didn't bother. The woman nimbly jumped outside. She jumped up to her husband and tried to help him up. I didn't feel sorry for them. From the looks of it, they're not poor. They'll get by somehow. While we were stomping around, a police car pulled up in front of the house. But it was me they were tying up. The pimply sergeant even hit me a couple of times with his fist, in the stomach, consolidating the success. The policeman cheerfully dragged me to the car, shouting something joyfully into the radio station at the police station. I showed the house documents to an important official in civilian clothes. He read the papers for a long time, moving his lips in a funny way. Then he sighed. "This is a matter for the court to decide. You had no right to kick the current owners out of the house and to abuse them." I did not comment on his words and asked him to make the phone call I was supposed to make. I quickly dialed the number. At the other end of the line, I was listened to carefully and disconnected. It was about half an hour later. The door to the office opened with a bang against the wall. The boss sitting opposite me even jumped from surprise. The body of a man in a cream suit floated into the office. He took a look around the room and said in a casual manner, "Arkady Roizman, I am Mr. Koltsov's lawyer." The man wagged his chin in my direction. On what grounds was my client detained? He tried to forcibly expel. The chief began to bleat something. But the lawyer didn't let him finish. "The legal owner of the house is my client. It is confirmed by documents." The voice of the lawyer completely filled the office. "Mr. Koltsov does not have to prove what is already obvious. You are required to release my client immediately." But he beat up the victim. The chief tried to put in his word. "The victim here is Mr. Koltsov. The people who tried to take over his house must leave immediately. And let them pray to God that Mr. Koltsov does not sue them for stealing his property." The lawyer waved some paper like a flag. "You must immediately send a squad and clear the house of invaders." Yes, an expert, I thought. He should be speaking at the UN. As I was leaving the station, accompanied by the lawyer and the police captain, I saw a familiar pimply sergeant standing by the car. "Just a minute, gentlemen, a little business." I walked up to the sergeant and knocked him out with a straight punch. With a straight punch to the jaw, as he fell, his head hit the side of the police car and his cap rolled aside. When I turned around, rubbing my bruised arm, the lawyer and the captain were looking the other way. The music came in waves, almost knocking me off my feet. I sat at the bar and poured myself a third glass. The bartender looked at me sympathetically. His eyes were screaming for more. I nodded. Suddenly, a painfully familiar face was reflected in the mirrored shelf. I sobered up. "Natasha." I quickly turned around. Next to her, hugging her by the waist, stood a lanky foreign man. To be honest, I was a little confused. Natasha didn't see me, and I decided not to rush to her with a shout. "Hello, my love." Something told me that I should wait. I turned to the bartender. He nodded understandingly. He seemed to have seen through my ruse. I sipped my whiskey slowly, trying to keep an eye on the couple's movements. Natasha was dressed in an expensive outfit. She was wearing an expensive gold necklace with brilliant stones around her neck. As an antique dealer, I know what to look for. From the looks of things, my ex-lover is in the clear. Then why is her daughter, Vera, not with her, but with a con artist named Galea? It's strange. If everything is fine, why doesn't Natasha take her daughter? Or maybe it's not her baby. Did the girl need a con artist to divorce me and gain pity? It's crazy. All these thoughts, swirling in my alcohol-soaked head, made it difficult for me to decide whether to approach Natasha or not. What if she's with Galea? The music suddenly stopped, leaving my ears ringing. I looked at the glass display case with the bottles. Natasha wasn't reflected in it, so they were seated at a table. Timorous and apulations, I cautiously turned around. Right, they were in the alcove. A waitress stood at the table where Natasha and her boyfriend were sitting. French teachers, the young woman leaned over and said something to her beau. He got up and walked towards the restrooms. Stuck to the Crescents people for Saint-Pierre-Act, I realized it was now or never. "Hello, my love." I spoke softly, but Natasha heard me perfectly well. "Where is it, Don?" Natasha stared at me for a while, then nodded nervously and looked around, searching for her companion with her eyes. "What's up? How are you?" they asked without raising my voice. How are you? She obviously didn't know what to talk to me about. "How is your daughter? Have you already taken her away from her friend?" Breathing to the Prussians, I asked sweetly, "What daughter?" "I don't have any children." "Go away, my husband will be back." Natasha looked around, confused again. "Who is Vera?" I started to boil. "Who's Vera? Get me alone." Natasha blushed. "My beloved met me unkindly. And this is the woman I've been dreaming about all these years. On the other hand, I must have invented the fairy tale of unearthly love. Natasha doesn't owe me anything." Suddenly, I was disgusted. I was about to get up when someone grabbed me from behind by the collar. I could see Natasha's pupils dilating with fear. "Don't, Toscaldas," she shrieked. As Rhea Peachins, I was thrown from my chair and fell, hitting my head on the floor. While I was trying to figure out what was going on, I got a solid kick in the right side of my leg. Assassins, I was drunk, but my reflexes worked, and I managed to regroup. A serious man at Natasha's, but jealous and bad. The jealous man wanted to kick me again, but I managed to grab him by the bony stag and yank him toward me. The man collapsed to the floor, at the same time pulling down the tablecloth and dishes. Now there are two of us on the floor. Not so lonely anymore, but it was time to do the honors. I got up as quickly as I could and staggered toward the exit, passing the bar. And in the glass window, I saw a jealous woodpecker rushing after me. Frankly, I was getting pretty tired of fighting with him. I let him get close, then took a step to the right and punched him in the eye. The jealous man collapsed on his back, obediently counting with his head the steps of the small staircase leading to the locker room. At that moment, the music blared and his pitiful squeak was drowned out by the crazy decibels. Why'd I have to get beaten up all the time? I felt so sorry for myself that I even brushed a tear off my cheek. I stood in the bathroom and looked at myself sympathetically in the mirror. There wasn't even anyone to feel sorry for me. On the cab ride home, I sobered up a bit, and that's not good. I went to the kitchen, took a bottle out of the cabinet, and fell down on my favorite couch with relief. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't alone in the house. Raising my head, I saw in the summer darkness of the hall, calmly sitting in an armchair, an old man with graying temples. How did he get in here? That's the first thing that came to my mind. This place is a back alley. It's not good to drink alone. Suddenly, the unexpected guest spoke. He took a telescopic plastic cup out of his coat pocket and with a sharp movement of his hand brought it into action. "I can bring a glass one," I muttered uncertainly. "No need," the man grinned. "This one is better." I poured the whiskey and we drank. Silence? That's good about it. The guest frowned. Just worse than our moonshine. We were silent for a while until the man got down to business. "You had a very productive trip to Central Asia." The client was very pleased. He lit a thin cigarette without asking permission. "But you will have to go back to those places again." I looked at the guest questioningly. "There's a little business. A very well-paid one." The man let out a thin stream of smoke from his mouth. "Silver again?" I asked, slowly coming to my senses. "No, not silver. I know of your adventures in Red Sands." The guest looked for an ashtray. "The one where you encountered the elusive worm. Your story impressed a very wealthy man to the point where he wanted the trophy." I almost choked, but I haven't seen it. That's just a guess. I was surprised beyond belief. "So figure out what it was. Mysticism or reality?" The guest stood up. "The fee will be." He said such a sum that my eyes went black. "When do I have to go?" The lust for profit threw away all doubts. Spent for that kind of money, I was ready to walk to Central Asia. A man you know well will contact you. He will give you the necessary instructions, help you with equipment, and provide necessary outfit. When will he contact me? Take your time, all in good time. The guest began to button his coat. "Just a moment, I have a favor to ask of you." I got up too. "Yes." The guest looked at me curiously. I told him about the recent events in my house and my assumptions about the people involved. The man listened to me and asked, "And what do you want? To take money from the crooks?" "No, it's not my money. You can keep it as a fee." I looked the guest straight in the eye. "I'm interested in the child. Who's he and where is he now? It's not God's way to give a girl hope and then return her to..." "All right, I hear you." The guest didn't let me finish. "To what to do with the crooks." "At your discretion," I said. The man turned and disappeared behind the front door. "Recently, I have a vintage radio in my office. Back in the 1950s of the last century. I took the receiver from my mother when she persistently complained about the abundance of old junk. It's a beautiful tube radio in working order. It had been bought by my grandfather, so it had been passed down to me as a sort of inheritance. It now stood on a vintage cabinet to the left of the table and delighted the eye with its perfect shapes. Yes, people knew how to make good things. Good things in their time. Time flies fast. Herein, radio receivers from the 1960s are becoming antiques. Yes, what are their receivers? School equipment from the 1970s and 1980s, i.e., now in the antique trend. I'm often contacted by fans of tape recorders from the late 1980s of the last century. They also ask about video equipment from the early 1990s, VCRs, analog camcorders, and tape recorders. 30 years ago, we used this equipment, believing that it could not be better, but now it has become vintage. DVD players are next. It seems that every generation, sooner or later, begins to feel nostalgic for a bygone time and may, without even realizing it, look for things that can bring them back to their past, at least for a while. To be honest, vintage radio equipment is not my area of expertise, but I have started to think more and more about opening a special department in my store dedicated to this topic. I believe that this direction of antique business is very promising. I made myself comfortable in the armchair, took out an empty bottle of Jameson from the depths of the table, and poured 2 fingers of the amber drink into the glass. There was no question of what to do. If there was a radio, it was necessary to listen to it. I looked out of the window. It was snowing, which was not quite typical for April. Large snowflakes were beating against the window like frozen butterflies, trying to make their way to the burning fireplace. It was cold, and I stood up and closed the window. Finally, a melody of a sentimental French song from the 1960s came out of the speaker. It was a wonderful time. Girls with natural breasts, stockings with elastic bands, short skirts that barely covered their panties. I even closed my eyes with nostalgic memories, clearly imagining that time, which I only knew from old magazines and movies. I decided to take a closer look at the things I had brought back from my last trip. I took 2 packages out of the desk drawer and laid them out neatly in front of me. Down in one, in a carved scabbard, was an ancient dagger, the hilt covered with silver tarnished from time. When I pulled it out of its sheath, the weapon fit into my hand. It seemed as if it had been made especially for me. In another bundle was a small figure of a cat-like animal made of some unknown material. It was probably carved from stone and covered with bronze paint. Its muzzle, with its mouth open, looked very spectacular. The eyes of the predator were skillfully embedded with black amethysts, a very rare variety of this semi-precious stone. The finest carving, hundreds of tiny strokes, all of this made the sculpture of the beast almost come to life. I placed the figurine on the mantelpiece and put the dagger on the table. Maybe someday I'll hang an antique handmade rug in my study with an antique weapon on it. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought the beast on the mantel clinked its teeth ravenously. The next morning, I received a text message with the address. I rewrote it in my notebook, knowing that the message would disappear in a minute. I smoked for a long time, staring at the wall. But life teaches me nothing. I'm always meddling in the wrong business, and I always end up, as usual, with black ingratitude and hatred. And I'm about to carry a burden that I'll have to bear for the rest of my life. What about the other side? There is no other side. What is this girl to me? Who is she to me? I can't save and warm everyone. It's her fate, and there's nothing I can do about it. Besides, where am I going to put her? I live alone, and I don't have any babysitters. That's a relief. I finally made the right decision. From this experience, I've clearly learned one truth. Most women, regardless of age, are monstrously ungrateful. My car was driving along a dirt road, periodically diving into shallow puddles and breaking thin ice with its wheels. It had been freezing since the night, but it was clear that spring had defeated the tedious winter. In an hour, the sun would warm up and the ice would melt, and the road would turn into an impassable swamp. Soon, a one-story barrack with walls blackened by time and rain appeared from behind a bend. I pushed open the shabby door and stepped into the dark corridor. It looked uninhabited, but judging by the voices coming from one of the rooms, there were people here. I went to the plywood door, leading into one of the rooms, and turned the knob without removing my gloves. The smell of rotten booze hit my nostrils. Opposite the entrance, at a table littered with leftovers and empty bottles, sat a half-naked woman with her head resting on her folded arms. Two homeless-looking men were arguing loudly about something. When I opened the door, all these picturesque characters stared at me in surprise. Even the woman raised her head with difficulty. "What do you want?" Coughed one of the men in a dirty overcoat worn over his naked body. "Where is the girl?" Trying not to breathe the unbearable stench, I asked loudly, "Alverda. She was here yesterday." Uncle seemed to be badly out of his mind with a terrible hangover. He pushed the woman. "Hey, what's up? Where's the girl? What do you need her for?" The woman mumbled, looking at me with eyes swollen from drinking. I ignored her question. Someone stirred on the iron bed against the opposite wall. One of the men nodded at a pile of dirty rags. "Here she is." Fear crawled out from under the rags. She didn't even have the strength to cry. Those bastards must not have fed her lately. I gently lifted the girl up, and she trustingly nuzzled her nose into my coat like a kitten. "Leave her alone." The woman tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't hold her, and she fell back on the stool. "I'm taking the girl." I honestly didn't care who Vera was. "What do you mean, I'm taking her?" The first man reacted. "We fed her, clothed her, and brought her up for nothing." I threw a few bills on the table. "It's enough." I could see the eyes of all the members of the team flashing greedily. Tapping the child in my coat, I went out to the car. Putting the girl in the back seat, I asked, "Do you remember Brie?" She nodded. If you enjoyed this story, please like and leave a comment. It's important for us and will help promote this video. Thank you for watching us.